I'd like to welcome our three panelists for our regulatory and legislative update this morning. Senior Vice President of Regulatory, I don't even remember your title now. It's so long. The Senior VP of Legal and Government Affairs, Santi Esposito and Michael Esposito. You guys can come on up. I know Santi and Michael do an outstanding job for us on the Hill, helping us kind of navigate some of the tumultuous waters in Washington, D.C. and behind the scenes, and these guys do a great job. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our esteemed panelists.
I do want to make mention of one particular thing out of the CFPB that I know most of you have at least touched on here in the last day or so in the various meetings, but the CFPB, you may recall, when the Dodd-Frank Act was passed in 2010 and created the CFPB, they were given exclusive jurisdiction from Congress to study the impact of arbitration agreements on consumer financial products and the impact on individual consumers. That study was about a 4-year process. Earlier this year, they released the results of that study, and there's some significant debate in the industry as to whether or not that study was truly comprehensive, and I think you can imagine where we come down on that issue. The results of that study had a couple of interesting conclusions. One being that the CFPB, and in their study, they really kind of focused on a couple of products that really don't affect our industry at all. They looked at credit card agreements primarily and a couple of banking-related things. But the conclusion that they reached in looking at that study was that, one, consumers generally do not know that arbitration agreements even exist in their contracts. I don't think that's true of our industry at all. But two, in conjunction with that, they believe that consumers have no idea that they're waiving certain rights as a result of those arbitration agreements. There are a whole bunch of other conclusions we won't take the time to get into, but with those two ideas as kind of the cornerstone of their view on arbitration agreements, here just a couple of weeks ago, they released a proposal that eventually will become a rule, or proposed rule. But in this proposal, they're looking at two different angles as it relates to arbitration. And mind you, when Congress gave the CFPB authority on the study of arbitration, they also gave them the authority to take a rulemaking proceeding that could go up to and including banning the use of arbitration agreements in consumer financial products. So auto lending being one of those things. CFPB in this proposal did not go that far, and Director Cordray was kind enough to remind the industry multiple times in multiple different ways that he elected not to go that far at this time. And I think he said at this time in one of the meetings I was at about 6 times in 6 different ways. But the proposal that's on the table right now for consideration is one that would eliminate the use of class action waivers if you're going to use an arbitration agreement in a financial product. So eventually we'll have some language, I suspect that the CFPB will propose by way of a specific rule that would mandate that you inform consumers that their arbitration rights are limited to individual actions, not a class action, up to and until the court makes a determination that a class is not going to be certified or those claims are dismissed. In conjunction with that, and going to the premise that the consumers don't know, at least in the CFPB's mind, don't know that they're giving up certain rights and that arbitration is a private process. The other portion of this proposal is that if you're going to use an arbitration agreement, you have to report to the CFPB what claims are taken to arbitration and what the award is. Now, as I mentioned, one of the things that the CFPB has the authority to do is to go as far as eliminating arbitration agreements altogether in financial products. It would not surprise me, based upon this little collection of data that they want to do, that at some point down the road they make a determination after reviewing all of these reported results and the claims asserted that the process just isn't fair to consumers. So we're going to take the next step and just ban these things altogether. I think really in my opinion, what they're trying to do with this is to do some specific data gathering that they weren't able to do in their arbitration study. Now, one of the things that I think we should be very proud of as an association is that the CFPB reached out to us and specifically asked that we provide them with some recommendations of some dealers that could serve on a small business review panel. Before the CFPB can implement any rule, they have to conduct a small business review panel that will study, or at least talk about study probably is a little bit too strong a word, but consider the impacts of any arbitration, excuse me, any rule that they make on small businesses. So with respect to this arbitration one, we've been asked to submit some names of buy here, pay here dealers that utilize arbitration agreements and meet a minimum threshold, or excuse me, I guess maximum threshold of gross revenue in a year. We're excited that they reached out to us and want our voice and our input. As coincidence would have it, that meeting of the Small Business Review Panel is scheduled for tomorrow. So while we're on the Hill, Phil Lathrop, Phil, are you in the room somewhere? We're going to put you on the spot, Phil. He's really going to be on the spot because he's not here. Phil Lathrop, who is the president of our Texas Association, is going to attend that. He's the one asked to serve on that panel. We're going to prepare him with a couple of arguments, and he's got some great ones already, and communicate our concerns with what the CFPB is doing. But I think by the end of the year, we can expect some proposed rule language, and it's going to revise the way that we utilize arbitration agreements. Today we're going to hear from the Department of Labor on a couple of different specific issues that they're interested in. I don't know if they'll touch on a proposed rule that they have out there right now, but let me just kind of make mention of it real quickly in case he does not. When the president was elected, one of the things that was a high priority of his was increasing pay, and you've seen that debate not only in Congress, you've seen it in state houses and city councils. But because the minimum wage discussion doesn't seem to be gaining much traction right now, there's a lot of different things that those advocates are looking to do that would increase pay without necessarily touching the minimum wage. And one of those is an exemption that applies for certain administrative, executive, and other professionals in business, where if you have a salaried position that meets a certain minimum threshold, then you would be exempt from receiving overtime pay if you go over 40 hours a week. That threshold, as it currently exists, is about $24,000 a year and roughly $450 a week. The proposal on the table from the Department of Labor is to double that threshold. So anybody that fits certain duties in their job, if they make over $51,000 and about $950 a week, they'd be still exempt from overtime. But if they fall below that threshold, then the potential of you having to pay them overtime for work over 40 hours increases significantly. We had some pretty strong comments in opposition to that. And you might imagine that all kinds of industries have commented to the Department of Labor. They're in the process of reviewing that right now, and I suspect that sometime in the first quarter of next year, or certainly by early summer, we can expect a final rule that significantly alters the way overtime compensation is considered. The concern that we have is kind of twofold. One, that it's really a one-size-fits-all approach that, quite frankly, doesn't work. You know, what you would pay an employee in New York City is going to be very different than what you'd pay an employee in Florence, South Carolina, or in Los Angeles County, or various parts of the country. We're also concerned about the idea that doubling that rate without any evidence in support of justifying a doubling is concerning, particularly when salaries have not increased at that same growth rate. We'll see how that plays out. We're certainly not the only ones in the business community that shared those concerns. We'll hear from the FTC today. They're going to talk a lot about various actions that they've been engaged in over the course of the last year, particularly as it relates to advertising. They've been heavily invested in enforcing the credit furnisher rule. I know that Malini will talk about that today. They'll talk a lot about their recent settlement with Sprint as it relates to risk-based pricing. That will affect you since you're subject to that risk-based pricing rule if you're doing certain types of credit. The other thing I just wanted to touch on very briefly is some things that are happening at the state level that we're heavily involved in and working with some of our state associations on. One of the things that has happened here recently is an increase in activity from the New York Attorney General's office in advertising enforcement and other things. Although this is not a particular enforcement action, the New York AG's office has an advertising guideline, and it's just a guideline, it's not a regulation, that deals with the use of the word certified in advertising. So certainly that impacts our certified pre-owned program. We've excuse me, we've reached out to the Attorney General's office and asked them to make a change to that guideline because of the fact that certified is not a word that is exclusive to the manufacturer world, which is the way their guideline is currently drafted. You can't advertise, according to the New York AG, you can't advertise the word certified unless you are a manufacturer using a certified program from the manufacturer. We'll see how that request goes. We've provided them some information that the NIADA certified pre-owned program really is no different than a manufacturer certified pre-owned program. The criteria are the same, the inspection process is the same, the players are the same. Our administrator, Warren Tech, is the same administrator that does administration for certain manufacturers as well. There's a couple of other things that we're tracking along with some of our industry partners in the payment assurance technology world. There's some bills that are percolating through New Jersey. There's one that's currently going to be introduced in Illinois. The state of Wisconsin had one here recently that deal with the use of GPS and starter-up technology. Those bills take different forms, from an outright ban of the products to a requirement to reduce interest rates if you're going to use the products, to potential criminal stalking sanctions if you're not going to use the products correctly. So we're kind of working with our industry partners to make sure that those bills either don't pass in current form, that they go so far as to impede our business, or are revised to the point where it represents responsible use of those products. And we're grateful to have the opportunity to work with our friends at the Payment Assurance Technology Association and other interested vendors on those bills. So we've got, today we're going to have lots of great regulators here. I hope that you'll come ready to ask questions. We're going to hear, like I said, from the Department of Labor, from the FTC. The other group that we'll have today is from the CFPB. They're going to be here to talk about the complaint database and what the portal looks like from a consumer perspective, from a business perspective, answer some of the questions and concerns that have been raised by industry as it relates to consumer complaint narrative data being released to the public, and how you can properly respond to that information, and timeliness of response to that information. And he even told me he wants to talk about how it can be a benefit to you. And certainly I hope you'll come prepared with any questions that you have relative to that as well. So I'm going to save my time and some of the things that I might say for those regulators, and hope you'll enjoy listening to them. Let's turn some time over to St. Michael to talk about some congressional matters.
Thank you, Sean. There are a number of bills and issues in the current Congress that impact the industry, but we're going to focus on the two issues that we're going to talk about tomorrow on the Hill, and those are our two issues that have the highest priority. Number one, recall safety. In the Senate highway bill, there's language in there that prohibits the sale, lease, or rental of rental vehicles that are subject to a safety recall unless and until the recall has been addressed. It's of concern to us because the bill defines a rental car entity as one that has a fleet of 5 or more rental vehicles. And that was a language that was put into the highway bill through the Commerce Committee. It was offered by the Democrats. The Republicans accepted it on the basis of the fact that Avis, Enterprise, and Hertz have signed off on the language. They have voluntarily agreed to implement the language that's in the bill, but the safety community is not accepting that as the end result. They want something enacted into law. Obviously, we have a concern about that provision on how it affects the industry. It doesn't define what a safety recall is. It's broad-based. Anything is a safety recall from, as mentioned earlier, a glove compartment malfunction as opposed to something which is truly a safety origin, which would require the grounding of a vehicle. Also, we deal with the same issues of our ability to correct the defect, the availability of parts, the impact on our inventory, etc. So we have some concerns about that provision. There was also an attempt in the Senate Highway Bill to put language in there that would take the same prohibition and apply it to the sale of used cars. That amendment was offered during the committee markup process. The amendment was defeated on a party line basis. The proponent of that amendment, Senator Blumenthal of Connecticut, tried to offer it on the Senate floor. The Republicans blocked that effort. So the Senate passed bill has the rental car prohibition language in it and nothing in it on used car prohibition. The House bill, the House companion bill to the Senate bill, was just reported out by committee a couple days ago. It'll go to the floor next week. It doesn't have either provision in there. Nothing in there on rental cars, nothing in there on used car. And we expect that bill to pass next week. We don't know what's going to happen in the amendment process on the floor. So one of the messages tomorrow is that any attempt to amend the bill with respect to adding anything on used car dealers, we are adamantly opposed to. Adamantly opposed to that. Any attempt to put language in there on rental cars, we are opposed to that. Plan B on rental cars, if there's an insistence to do something to placate the safety community, doing something on rental cars and not on used car, is that we would propose language to convert the prohibition to a notification process. We are working very closely with NADA and NAAA on both issues. We have been working the Hill, we've been working the committees of jurisdiction, we've been working the leadership, we've been working the Rules Committee. So now the challenge is to try to figure out what they're going to fashion in terms of how they're going to deal with this bill on the floor and what that means for us in terms of the amendment process. I could mention to you that NADA has done a study through J.D. Power, which has not been made public yet, but what I'm hearing from the folks over at NADA, that's going to show some substantial financial impact on the used car industry if something like a used car recall prohibition language is enacted into law. So we're going to see what happens over the next week on that. The second issue we want to talk about tomorrow is the indirect auto financing guidance bill, H.R. 1737, which has been introduced in the House of Representatives by a Republican from New Hampshire. Has 162 co-sponsors, 65 of them Democrats, and we're trying to push it as a bipartisan bill. And what the bill does is that it rescinds the 2013 guidelines that the CFPB issued having to do with indirect audit financing and limiting the flexibility of dealers in setting interest rates. What it says is that not only is that rescinded, but that if they are going to take a look at that process anew, they have to do it in an open, transparent way, which they did not do the last time around. It was a unilateral decision, no reaching out to stakeholders, no public hearings, etc. That bill we expect to go to the House floor in 2 to 3 weeks. So the message tomorrow is we're looking for an aye vote on that bill. In the next couple of days, we are going to be providing Steve with a list of about 60 members of the House of Representatives, a list that has been put together by us, NADA, and NAAA, and we want to reach out to those members for support on the legislation. We want this bill to pass on a bipartisan basis so we can send a message to the White House and to the CFPB and hopefully avoid having to go through the same process in the Senate and have CFPB cut a deal on this issue. When you get an email from NIADA headquarters on the request for you all to reach out to your members, the members who are on the list of the 50 or 60, please do that. It makes all the difference in the world. It's much better if they hear from a constituent than they hear from a lobbyist. And that's one of the reasons why we're excited about the meetings tomorrow, because in each and every one of the meetings, there is somebody who is going to be leading that meeting who is a constituent of the member's office that we're meeting with. So it's very important that you respond to that. So those are the two issues that we're focusing on, which are immediate. We fully expect that the transportation bill will be enacted into law probably no later than November 20th, which means this issue on rental cars and used cars and recall safety is going to be resolved by then, and hopefully the CFPB at least passes the House by that time. I think Mike's going to talk a little bit about the political situation going on in Congress and the House of Representatives and how it's impacting everything I just talked about.
Morning. So kudos to association staff for picking October 28th as your day on the Hill, because tomorrow the House will elect a new speaker. There'll be a flurry of activity tomorrow during your House meetings. It's still up in the air in terms of when the vote will be held. The vote tomorrow will be held by the Republican Party. They will decide on the speaker. Then Thursday, they'll take that to the floor for a vote from the entire House. So right now, it's Paul Ryan. If you were to ask everybody in D.C. who would the speaker be about a month ago, everybody would have said McCarthy out of California, and we were all taken by surprise with the developments there. But Paul Ryan, who's currently the chair of the Ways and Means Committee, is expected to be the next Speaker of the House. Parliamentary rules state that the Speaker of the House cannot serve in any other capacity in Congress, so that individual cannot serve on another committee in Congress. So Paul Ryan will step down as chair of Ways and Means. Ways and Means is the committee in the House that takes care of all the taxation side of the bills. So when you need revenue, when you need to figure out how to fund a bill, that's the committee that takes care of it. As an example, Santi spoke about the highway bill. The highway bill has been done by all the committees in the House except the Ways and Means Committee, because they can't figure out how to fund the bill. There'll be a race to figure out who the next speaker, who the next chair of Ways and Means will be. Right now, it's a three-man race between T. Berry of Ohio, Brady of Texas, and now Nunez of California. That process is taken care of by a 20-member steering committee. All 20 members are Republicans who will get together and appoint the new chair of Ways and Means. Paul Ryan controls about 5 of those votes on the steering committee, so he's very close to Congressman T. Berry. So all of the thinking in D.C. is that Congressman T. Berry will take over Ways and Means chair. Now, it's important to note that the Speaker controls the legislative agenda. So no matter what piece of legislation you have, no matter how insignificant it is, no matter how important it is, you have to go through the Speaker's office to be able to get the time on the floor to take your bill to a vote. So the Speaker is obviously the most powerful person in the House of Representatives. Everything goes through him. He can stop or he can fast track whatever he'd like. So again, you all will see a flurry of activity tomorrow on the Hill revolving around the Speaker's vote. They're still trying to whip enough votes for Thursday's vote when they take it to the floor. But you know, DC always has its version of gridlock. This is just another thing that delays the process, because you can't move something like the House Transportation Bill without a taxation title, a revenue title. You can't do that without a chair of Ways and Means. So it just delays the process.
All right, we are very excited about the opportunity to be up on the Hill tomorrow and take these two important issues to our industry up there. Santi and Michael done a fantastic job in coordinating things for us there tomorrow, and you are the key role in all of that process. So let's give Santi and Michael a hand, and we'll get ready for our next meeting.